What's up, everyone? Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Emma Chasen, Cannabis Educator and Industry Consultant at Eminent Consulting. Hello, Emma Chasen.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Absolutely. Yes, we were just talking about how fun your glasses are for people that are just listening. Emma has really cool glasses on. How would you explain what shape they are?
So they're like a modified cat eye, according to the website that I get them on, and they are bright pink.
Exactly. They fit your fun personality,
Thank you.
Yes. So I'm really excited for you to be on. I got to start by saying I really do enjoy the content that you're putting online. Particularly, I like the Ask Emma segments, and you're debunking different myths, I guess, that are related to cannabis. But I don't know if that's what the whole segment or the whole thing's about.
Yeah, I mean, with the Ask Emma web series, which I'm glad that you're watching, thank you. Well, I really wanted to reach out to people who maybe were still trepidatious about cannabis use or still believed some of those negative stigmas and really help them to feel more comfortable about what is factual, scientific, evidence-based information versus what is either propaganda by the war on drugs or just kind of hearsay and anecdotal reports that maybe don't really hold up when we do look at the science behind the plant. So one of my favorite things to do in that web series is to debunk common myths. Again, just as a way of highlighting, like, here is what most people believe. It's totally understandable that you believe that considering the war on drugs, but here is the actual factual information behind it.
Right. Yeah. One of them I saw was the myth Indica versus Sativa, right? The traditional belief that Sativa is more of like a caffeine upper high, whereas Indica is more couch lock effect.
Totally. Yeah, that's a big one for me, the Indica sativa myth.
Yeah. So debunk that, please.
Okay, cool. So when I teach this topic, especially to my students, I really look back to the creation of these terms. So indica and sativa were created by taxonomists during the Age of Enlightenment. So we're talking like mid 1700s when people started to question that the church was the reason for everything, that God was the reason for everything. So we saw kind of like scientific methodology come into play that really laid the foundation for Darwin to come on the scene in the 1800s. And something that happened during the 1700s was this explosion of taxonomical classification, which means the way in which we classify biological organisms based on shared characteristics. So the father of modern taxonomy, we can say, Carl Linnaeus, in 1753, he defined the cannabis plant, and cannabis is a genus, which is a rung in taxonomy, and he specifically noted a species, and that species was sativa, and in his definition of the species, he noted a tall, lanky morphology with these loose female flowers, this narrow leaf variety. And as I tell my students, at no point is there any account of Linnaeus like rolling up a doobie of cannabis sativa and being like, oh my God, I'm like flying off the walls right now. He only noted morphology, right? The way in which the plant grew. And then about 30 years later, another taxonomist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he was traveling in India and he came across another cannabis plant. And he looked at that one and he said, oh, okay, like there's a lot of differences between this plant compared to the one that Linnaeus classified. It's actually really short and bushy. It has these broad leaves. Yeah.
And how many years apart was that?
That was about 30 years later. So around 1785. Yeah. And he classified cannabis indica and he named it indica because he was in India. And again, at no point is there any account that he smoked this indica and was like, oh, I am laid in the couch right now. So, I mean, we have no proof per se. We have no historical account that the species ever correlated to effect. And even if they did at one point, it is nonsensical for us to rely on that species distinction to predict experience now, because everything has been so hybridized, meaning that the indica and sativa genetics have been crossed together so many times, especially during Prohibition, when we had no kind of scientific legitimacy or accounts of breeding, that what we see on the current market is mostly hybridized genetics. Therefore, it doesn't really make sense to use the indica or the sativa species distinctions to best predict experience for people.
Yeah, that makes total sense the way you put it that way. And in the hybridized genetics, like you talked about, of these different, they're different genetics, right? They're just different species, as you said. You have indica, you have sativa, but in addition to that, and the breeding of those two, there are secondary compounds that also add to this, right? I mean, you get the terpenes, the flavonoids, things like that. So that also, because of those variables, it's just so hard to tell, right? It's impossible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And those variables, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, the flavonoids, they are influenced by environmental factors. So even if you have a strain, like let's say cherry pie, that's grown by one grower, it may make you feel a different type of way if it's grown by another grower in a different kind of cultivation methodology. And so it's really important that we look to the concentrations and the ratios of these compounds in every single batch, because they're the ones that we're actually consuming, right? When we inhale, we're not inhaling the plant morphology. We're not inhaling the species. We're not inhaling the strain name. We're inhaling those compounds that are then going to bind to our receptors and engage with our body to make us feel a certain type of way.
So I'm just curious, and I know we probably will never know the answer, but how did that belief become so mainstream? You know, I mean, I understand that the peer review studies have lacked over the years due to the Schedule 1 of marijuana, right, deemed by the federal government, and those restrictions. But like, is it anecdotal? I mean, is it a way to make it just easy for us to understand and classify in that way at the time, or?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really know, right? So we can't say for sure, but I think that it was kind of this like adoption of language and vernacular, especially in underground communities. So in the Prohibition era, I also think that maybe at some point, compounds that were more energizing or uplifting were more concentrated in the sativa species, and compounds that were more relaxing may have been more concentrated in the indica species. That's also a theory out there, that the compound distribution did actually have some correlation to genetics. However, again, with research that we have now, that's been kind of debunked. Again, we can't say for sure, because those compounds do have like the environmental factor piece there. So I think that ultimately it's just kind of how language evolves, and especially more illicit underground communities kind of adopt coded language to mean something.
Sure. No. Yeah. Though that's a good way to put it. You know what I really like about your background is that not only obviously is it heavy and strong on the science side, right, when it comes to oncology or specifically the cannabis plant, but the history knowledge or awareness that you have also, right? So for our audience listening or watching, you know, Emma's background, she went to Brown, she studied how she took various classes, but there were classes that focused on how indigenous people across the world are using plant medicine in ceremony. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, and what type of plants were you guys focused on?
Yeah, so very lucky to go to Brown where it is open curriculum. We have no kind of core requirements, and I was able to design this track in the biology department that looked at ethnobotany, which is the study of the way in which indigenous peoples use medicinal plants in healing kind of ceremonial context. And we focused a lot on indigenous Amazonians who would use ayahuasca. That was a big part of the program. We also looked at Pacific Islanders who would use kava. We really kind of went around the globe per se and looked at these different plants, even iboga, so ibogaine and Yes.
What's the second one you said? You said ayahuasca and then koa?
Kava.
Oh, what's that?
Yeah, so kava, it is the root of a plant, or the root is the part that you traditionally consume. And in indigenous Pacific Islander tribes, there was a lot of hostility and violence throughout history, where they were kind of deemed as like headhunting, where when they would go into war, I mean, it would be quite murderous. And so before they would have war, the two like chieftains would meet and they would drink this preparation of kava, which is a plant native to that area, and you masticate the roots. So you traditionally would chew up the roots and then spit it out into a bowl, and then these chiefs would drink it. And what it does is it really relaxes you. So there are kava bars now popped up around the country. There are many in Hawaii, since that's where the plant is native to.
So no psychedelic experience, just more of like euphoria and relaxation.
Exactly. Yeah. Like deep anti-anxiety energy, where you could just like completely relax. There's almost like a numbing sensation, I'd
Got
say.
Okay. So, okay. Thank you for breaking that down. And then you said ibogaine, which is funny because my last guest, Stephen Gottlieb, is actually a ibogaine practitioner, and we talked all about it. So,
Oh,
what was your studies and learnings around that?
yeah. I mean, I was fascinated by the way in which that indigenous people from Africa would use iboga in order to initiate from like boyhood into manhood. And that's a really common thread, I'd say, throughout all of these indigenous communities, is that these like potent psychedelic plant medicines are used for that kind of initiation into adulthood. Even ayahuasca, right, is like that. And with iboga, I mean, I've never done it myself, so I don't have the personal experience behind it, but from reading about the accounts and even the physiological impact of ibogaine, it like really can change your brain chemistry. And as far as like the Western adoption of it, it has promise for its like anti-addiction elements, where it really can help people overcome addiction and deep trauma, because of how like intense the psychedelic spiritual journey is.
Yes, that's exactly what he was talking about. How it's just such a good, I guess, treatment for addictive behavior, especially when it is related to like opioid addiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Alternative as opposed to going the route of methadone and whatnot. But of course, everyone's different and reacts to different things different ways. But it's something out there. So what other plants did you study in your courses?
Yeah. So there was, I mean, Salvia, there was Brugmansia,
Salvia is a trip.
Salvia is a quite a trip.
It's
Yeah.
it's so crazy. I remember it being like, yeah, so I'm 30, 31, and in high school, I remember, and even in college, there was salvia that would be sold in head shops and whatnot. And I remember trying it once, and I had such a bad experience, but it only lasted like, like a minute, maybe.
Hmm.
But like it seemed very like I didn't feel good. Like I kind of felt itchy and stuff. I don't know if it was a bad batch or what it was, but what's your experience with salvia?
Yeah, I mean, I again have never tried it myself. I tried it once and it didn't really do much for me, but from the anecdotal reports of many people, I'd say that most people say that they had a really bad trip, that they felt like the world was kind of caving in on them, that they kind of lost all sense of their reality, but not in a way that was like, oh, fun and freeing, in a way that was like they ended up in like a distorted fun house type of situation, and they just did not they did not have any awareness around like where they were, they were with. But it is very quick. So it kind of like pops you out of it really quickly. I think that that is like I call Salvia kind of like the poor man's DMT, where DMT is also really quick if you smoke it or inhale it, and you can have really beautiful experiences with DMT. Whereas, like, I mean, with Salvia, it just seems to be overwhelmingly negative for people.
That is such a great way to put that. Oh my gosh, the poor man's DMT. Yeah, that's I've never heard it put that way, but it makes a lot of sense. My experience, I'll share. It was horrible. It was exactly like you said, that distorted kind of fun house negative vibe. I'm at a friend's apartment and we smoked it, and then I just look and in the background I just see leaves and like different like forestry kind of be like growing in his living room, and then he turned off the light and put a strobe light on, and every time
Oh,
the light hit me, I felt like it was like shards of glass hitting me. So like my hair was standing up, I was feeling like every time that light flashed. It was horrible.
oh God, yeah, that sounds incredibly painful.
I mean, I literally felt pain. It was really
Oof.
so never again.
Mm-mm.
Lesson learned, but thankfully that was years ago. So I've learned my lesson since then. But so you've talked a lot of different plant varieties, right? And how these indigenous people would use this as the Western world would say holistic type of medicine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when did you start really focusing on cannabis at your time at Brown, or was there a lot of studies and research or interest in cannabis within those classes, or was it more of these other plants?
So we talked about cannabis for sure, but this was in my undergraduate. It was from 2010 to 2014, and this was in Rhode Island. My university was in Rhode Island, and so the medical market in Rhode Island was like just starting to gain traction in regards to the cannabis industry. But there was still a lot of stigma, and from the university perspective, since they do get federal funding, they were very hesitant to talk about cannabis at all. And actually, as part of my independent thesis research project during my senior year, I really wanted to look at cannabis and do just some studies where it was kind of like simple, like stress studies, where I would grow a variety of plants and then stress them light or water or fertilizer, and kind of measure out their compounds based on that. However, the university was not happy with that, so denied me, but I did my project instead on Mexican oregano. I was like kind of like a to the establishment. But I mean, Mexican oregano has amazing therapeutic properties, specifically an antiviral. So my thesis was still great and I was happy with it. But I will say that a lot of my study at Brown was personal in regards to cannabis. So I was kind of reading whatever I could get my hands on, but there wasn't much out there for me at the time. And then when I graduated and I went on to work at the Brown University Oncology Research Group, I thought that that could be my place of impact with cannabis, considering that we were running clinical oncology trials across the country through the FDA. And again, cannabis just starting to gain traction as a therapeutic, and its medicinal value was really kind of exploding in more mainstream media. And we actually had a brilliant professor who proposed a cannabis trial, and my supervisor just laughed him out of the office. And that to me was like, okay, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I got to move on.
Wow. So that's impressive. I mean, so from that moment or that experience, you're like, this is not where I fit in. This is not my purpose. And that's kind of what led you down this path.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, it seems like almost crazy in hindsight, where I am a born and raised New Yorker. I really never left the East Coast, right? Went to school in the Northeast, but I packed up my car and somehow convinced my best friend to drive across the country with me and move to Portland sight unseen. We've never been there before. But I was just like, I need something new. I was actually thinking about going to naturopathic school, and there are like two accredited naturopathic schools in the country. One's in Portland, one is outside of Seattle. Decided on Portland, moved there, having never been here before, and just kind of like, okay, we'll see how it goes. And it was very serendipitous in my arrival, as it was 1 month before the early onset of adult use sales here in Oregon. So every cannabis business was hiring, and I needed a job really bad. My friend found a Craigslist posting for this job at this dispensary kind of around the corner. So I was like, all right, I'll try it out, and very, very luckily landed a gig at that dispensary that took and continues to take a really scientific approach to cannabis. And so it was there that I was able to kind of dive headfirst into the industry and the science behind the plant.
That's amazing. I love these stories where, you make a decision knowing that it's the best decision for you and what you want and what to be happy. And you jumped in a car with a friend and drove to Portland, and the rest is history,
Yeah. Yeah, totally. That kind of like, just like be bold, and everything good is on the other side of risk.
I totally believe that, you have to go through some adversity and challenges to end up where you want to be, as
Mm-hmm.
it is. So when you say that the dispensary that you worked for had a real scientific approach, I live in Texas. There are no dispensaries out here, right? So what does that look like? What does that mean compared to like a traditional dispensary out there?
Sure. So the dispensary's name is Pharma, and they have gained quite a kind of prestigious place within not only the Oregon market, but kind of in the national landscape as being one of the first, if not the first dispensary to reject that Indica Sativa classification. So they were the ones that were classifying and continue to classify their flower based off of relaxing or uplifting or more of an experience-based spectrum. And so that's where I got introduced to that concept. And of course, also was very encouraged to read as many books as I could get my hands on and white papers. And even then, I mean, this was now over 5 years ago. And so they were the only ones who were doing some kind of education. And even then it wasn't great. It wasn't like, how if you're a bartender, you go and you train and you make sure you take a course to learn every kind of liquor and mixology, that just did not exist at all for cannabis. So for pharma to be doing even the little bit that they was pretty revolutionary at the time. And then kind of the best thing that they did for me was really empower me to run with that idea of education and training, because given my academic background as I bud tended and then like quickly moved up into more of a general management role, I just was completely taken aback by the lack of education and saw it as such a liability for the business that these patients and consumers were coming in and asking us questions, asking the staff questions that their doctors couldn't even answer. And like the staff was not trained on how to respond to that. So not only a disservice to the consumer market, but also a liability for the business. And that's where I was like, no, I need to create some kind of curriculum for training and education on the fundamentals of cannabis science and product knowledge so that we can arm staff to better be able to serve the community. And that's what I did.
And that was that light bulb moment then, right? So you go to pharma, they're very science focused in their approach to cannabis. You quickly move up from bud tender to GM and then you see this gap where all of a sudden these people are actually looking for answers that are related to their health. And so is that where your company Eminent Consulting was born?
Yeah. So it was a little bit of like a bumpy road to get there, I'd say. But first, I kind of stepped down from my role as general manager within the dispensary, focused full-time on education. I was the one who kind of pioneered and championed this role in dispensaries, which is now more prevalent, of director of education, somebody whose full-time job is to look out for the education and training of the staff. So I did that for a few months and then eventually handed that over to somebody else to focus full-time on my business with my co-founder, who I met in that dispensary, Matt Taylor, who brings a kind of a wealth of information around like cultivation, financials, as well as art and design. And together we form Eminent Consulting, that not only provides educational training courses specifically formulated for bud tenders, but also used by lay enthusiasts as well as other industry professionals. And then we also do a lot of business consulting and strategic planning for emerging entrepreneurs into the cannabis space who really want to adopt more of a craft ethos, boutique practices, and science forward strategy.
And so what does that curriculum and that training look like? I mean, is that in person? Is it online? Uh,
Mm.
what type of format is it for people that are interested?
Sure. So it is currently all online, and that we actually did right before COVID happened. So it was really, again, serendipitous, to be able to upload all of that content and put it out there. And they are videos of me speaking, and there's a lot of like text and animation that's incorporated. We also have a lot of like learning games and assessments, as well as downloadable PDFs that people can print out and kind of bring to the sales floor with them. For us, we wanted to create a training program that we like wanted as bud tenders, that combined not only the rigorous science and the scientific evidence, but that explained it in a way that was digestible and accessible for everyone. And that was also fun. I mean, cannabis is really fun. Cannabis science is like the most fun to me. And I think that if we communicate especially science of all kinds, in a way that is digestible and whimsical and fun, it will attract more people to believing in science. And currently, that is really, really important.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been lacking for so long. I mean, no one's fault, right? It's just been something that we've had to deal with due to the federal regulation. But it's so great to hear that, you're focused on producing content and information that's helpful to everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just
Yep.
people that are specifically in the industry or whatnot. That general knowledge is very important. So that leads me to my question: has research and findings around cannabis related to medicinal properties and therapeutic properties, has that changed since you were at Brown, and if so, how?
Oh my God, definitely. So we have so much more research than we did 10 years ago, when I was just beginning this journey into understanding cannabis, and specifically in regards to clinical trials. So Israel especially is championing human clinical trials, and that's huge. We talk about research around cannabis, and a lot of the rhetoric and the dialogue around that has been, oh, well, there's not enough research around cannabis in order to legalize it or promote its use or whatever it may be. But I call BS on that. I mean, THC is one of the most researched compounds on the planet. However, a lot of that research was funded by agencies that were looking specifically for negative effects of THC so that they could promote war on drugs and they could keep it kind of like locked down as a Schedule 1 substance. And so a lot of that research is buried, unfortunately. But still, even the research that's out there, we have a ton of information on THC. But a lot of it is done in animal models. So looking at how it influences mice and rats. And yes, they have an endocannabinoid receptor system. Yes, they absolutely can be influenced by THC. However, it's not the same as humans, right? And so looking at the data that's coming out of not only Israel, but also Italy and New Zealand and the Czech Republic and even Jamaica, to look at how humans respond to cannabis is really, really important. And I've noticed quite an uptick in that in the last 10 years.
That's good to hear. That's encouraging. I always try to make things really like simple and simplistic, and and so one fact that just comes out to me when it comes to research and study around THC is that it's impossible to overdose. You can't die from THC.
Yes. And that is that's one of my favorite facts because it really puts people at ease. And not only THC, but also CBD and CBG and all these other compounds. And the reason being is that there are not receptors on the part of our brain, which is the brain stem that controls our brain, our heart, and our lungs. these compounds can't bind to the place that controls those functions that are essential for life, right? And so there's no chance that these compounds can shut down your breathing or your heart or your brain, which makes people feel really safe. Now, that's not to say that, I mean, there aren't negative side effects and that you may feel like you're dying when you consume too much THC, but
specifically, right? Edibles.
yes, completely. Where like everybody has that story of they ate one too many brownies and they were on the floor and they were like, I am going to die. You know, that's how it makes you feel, but you won't. From a physiological standpoint, cannabis cannot kill you. At least at this point, there is no defined lethal dose, and just giving that fact to people automatically makes them feel more comfortable with experimentation, because especially as you're new to cannabis, it does take a little bit of experimentation to really kind of feel out what works for you.
Right. And while we're talking about THC and you mentioned the other cannabinoids, let's kind of dive into each of them, right? So at least the ones that are currently identified, yet we have THC, which we just talked about. There's also CBD, CBG, and CBN that at least I've heard about. So do you want to talk a little bit about those cannabinoids and how they're different from one another?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start with CBG, as I call CBG our mother or our stem cell cannabinoid. This is the first cannabinoid that is made in the plant, and CBD, THC, and a cannabinoid called CBC are defined or made from CBG in the actual matrix of the cannabis plant. CBG, as far as its properties, its physiological properties or therapeutic applications, research has suggested that it could be really instrumental in shutting down the cell cycle and also reducing tumor size in some cancers. So it's being investigated as kind of like a novel approach to managing certain types of cancers. Also, it has been shown to relax the smooth muscle, specifically of the digestive system. So also being investigated as kind of a novel therapeutic approach for IBS and Crohn's disease. And then it seems to also have some anti-anxiety and antidepressant effects. It shouldn't really get you high, so it's not going to be intoxicating in the same way that THC is, but it definitely seems to have some therapeutic potential. I will also say that CBC, which is a cannabinoid that is made from CBG, it is the least common cannabinoid, so it's kind of left out of the conversation because you rarely hear it. However, there are some breeding techniques that are like boosting that content because it has specifically been shown to be an effective antibiotic in helping to fight against certain types of infections, and also has some therapeutic potential as an anti-anxiety, mood elevator, etc. And then we have our cannabinoids that are actually we have our cannabinoids that are actually devised from the degradation of other cannabinoids. So CBN, for example, is the oxidative byproduct of THC. So when THC is exposed to light and oxygen, you get CBN. And CBN has been shown to have an effect on mood in that it can make you really sleepy. So if you've ever had some kind of old weed that's just been sitting out on the table, exposed to light, oxygen, and you go to smoke it about a few weeks, a month later, and you get really groggy, that's probably because you're consuming a lot of CBN. But again, has some therapeutic value and potential in its action as an antioxidant as well as an antibiotic.
And that was a really helpful explanation, and I love the way you put it. So thank you for that. What other cannabinoids that have you heard about or have you learned about that aren't currently identified? By the mainstream people or public.
Yeah. So there's the THCV and the CBDV. Kind of analyte that falls under the umbrella of the THC and CBD families. So THCV is really helpful with appetite suppression, as well as anti-inflammatory action. And so people who are looking to offset that munchie experience, or who don't want to eat a lot, or maybe who need help with weight management, THCV is a really good compound to look out for. And it is typically found in South African varieties, specifically like Durban poison. We see a pretty consistent concentration of THCV in that variety. CBDV, on the other hand, seems to be really, really helpful as an antispasmodic agent. And actually, researchers believe that CBDV is the real like anti-epileptic powerhouse behind CBD. So of course we have CBD, all of these reports and scientific evidence that shows that CBD is really helpful in managing seizure disorders. And scientists actually believe that CBDV is the compound that often kind of tags along with CBD to help in this anti-epileptic action.
Wow. And I've heard that CBD also serves in a way to counteract the effects of THC. Is that true?
Yes, yes. So THC and CBD, I believe that they work better together, where CBD and THC, when consumed in low concentrations, can actually help to amplify the therapeutic potential of the experience while offsetting or mitigating any of the more uncomfortable side effects that are often kind of spurred by overconsumption of THC. So we're talking like reduction in anxiety and paranoia, the elevated heart rate, and so on. And the reason that this happens is because THC and CBD actually bind to the same receptor in our brain. So there is a cannabinoid receptor in our brain. It's called CB1, and you can think of it as like a little Y shape that kind of just like sits on your neurons, and THC can bind to that main site. So right in that middle of the Y, THC can pop in there, and when it does, it initiates a bunch of signaling pathways that make you feel high, but that also contribute to anti-inflammatory action, pain relief, anti-cancer, et cetera, et cetera. But if you consume too much, then your receptors can get really overloaded and you can feel anxiety and paranoia, et cetera. But what happens when THC is bound to that main binding site on that receptor? So as it sits in the Y, the receptor actually shifts and it changes conformation and opens up a secondary binding site on that same receptor where CBD can come and bind. And when both THC and CBD are bound to the same receptor, the signaling pathways that are initiated are actually for amplified therapeutic potential. So more anti-inflammatory action, more pain relief, more anti-cancer action, and there is a reduction in the intoxicating effects, specifically in the uncomfortable side effects of anxiety and paranoia, etc. And so for people looking to amplify their medicinal efficacy of cannabis, and also like who are a little afraid of that uncomfortable experience associated with THC, then low doses of THC and CBD together are the way to go.
Which, and when, if they're looking at a retail store, it's really labeled as full spectrum, right? As opposed to isolate. Full spectrum includes the different cannabinoids instead of just the isolated THC or CBD or what have you. Is that?
Yes, absolutely. So full spectrum means that you're going to get as close to a full range of compounds that were present in the initial plant material used in the final product.
So Emma, you've done a great job of explaining how cannabis and the various cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant can really transform our health. So now I want to talk about the benefits on the agriculture side, right? The 2018 hemp or farm bill was passed, where now farmers can grow mass cultivations of hemp throughout the United States. And so I want to get your thoughts on the education part of that side of the plant, and what you're thinking from that perspective.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, CBD is now widely available, which I think is great. I see, it's funny because people say like, ooh, cannabis is a gateway drug, right? That was a big thing and during Prohibition, but I see CBD as kind of like a gateway into the like beautiful possibility of cannabis. So for people who are, again, trepidatious, a little nervous about trying cannabis, seeing CBD so widely available is really kind of helpful for people to try it out, see that it's not so scary, and then feel more comfortable exploring not only cannabis, but also plant medicine as a whole, which I think for me is the goal here. I will say though that because there are not a lot of regulations specifically in the formulation and the analytical testing that has to be done around these CBD products, that there's a lot of snake oil on the market. So it's really, really important that as a consumer, you do your own research to investigate the company to make sure that they're growing hemp ethically and organically. Hemp is a bioaccumulator, as is cannabis, in that it soaks up whatever you put into it. So if you're spraying pesticides, if you are growing it in soil with some kind of like inorganic fertilizer, then it's going to concentrate those more yucky compounds in its tissues. And then when it goes to be concentrated down into an oil or a product, that is going to get concentrated down even further, right? And so you may be doing more harm than good depending on how your plant material was grown. So that's really important. It's really important that you make sure that the company is testing for not only cannabinoids and terpenes, but also heavy metals and pesticides and such for that very reason. And then finally, I believe that full spectrum is the most therapeutic application because of the entourage or ensemble effect. So all of those compounds are working together to produce the most like therapeutic application possible. And that's going to be really important for you to see an effect when you do consume these products.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and outside of like CBD and, you know, producing hemp for extraction purposes for oils, distillates, crude, thing like that, right? I'm talking like more on the industrial hemp side for material goods. So,
Mm.
you know, what are your thoughts on, you know, the fact that hemp, you know, when grown outdoors and separated from its fiber and herd, can produce things like houses and produce plastics for cars and can generate biomass fuel, and you know, what's your thoughts on the future in that market, in that space?
Oh my God, I think it's incredible. And I think it is so necessary, especially since we are in a climate crisis. Like that is absolutely happening where, I mean, the ocean is covered in plastics, temperatures are rising. It's really detrimental that we just like get our act together in regards to the environment. And I think that hemp on the more industrial side offers us an alternative to something like plastic, for example, where you can make hemp plastics that are completely biodegradable. Hemp packaging is really important. In regards to the cannabis industry, it's often lauded as the green industry, and that's a joke, you know, because we use so much packaging, so much hard plastics that actually can't be recycled often. Whereas if we switch to hemp plastics, of course, that would change. And so I think that it just offers some incredible opportunity for us to be able to integrate hemp not only into plastics, but also food, clothing, fibers, nutritional aspect. There's a lot of protein in hemp hearts, and that could really have an impact, especially as we continue to find innovative ways to respond to the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing.
Yeah. Well, and along those lines of the current climate crisis that we're in, I mean, there's been guests on the show that have talked about how much CO2 emissions the hemp plant takes in and how it cleans the soil. So, what's your knowledge on that?
Yeah, I mean, I will give a disclaimer that I'm not a cultivator, so I don't specialize in the agricultural side. However, again, that idea or that fact that hemp is a bioaccumulator, so it will accumulate whatever's in the soil, whatever you spray onto its tissues. But that also means that if you plant it in soil that has been, let's say, poisoned with radiation, like they did in Chernobyl, where they planted a bunch of hemp at the site of Chernobyl, and it really helped to clean up not only the soil, but also the air. That is huge, you know, for it to be able to recycle these toxins that we definitely cannot ingest or consume or inhale, right? But for the hemp plant to be able to kind of take them in and recycle them from the environment, again, is a real optimistic thing about this whole industry, where it definitely gives me hope that there is some innovative strategies that we can employ to help our environment.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and you touched on the environmental impact that hemp could have, the many applications that hemp has when it comes to material goods, and then the medicinal benefits of the cannabinoids. And what I'm really just when it comes to education, the industrial hemp side, that's where I think will really help generate more widespread understanding of the cannabis plant and the benefits outside of just what's currently kind of common knowledge as on the medicinal therapeutic side. And I'm saying this because the more understanding that people have of the potential when it comes to industrial hemp and the economic impacts that it have, and the how it can address the climate crisis, as you mentioned, it's something where if you don't even want to take part in it, it removes the stigma, but you got to understand it. You got to be aware of how it's beneficial. And the more that people, if they don't want to be associated with it, or they don't want to touch it, or don't want to use it, at least that understanding will help move the needle, I think. So what do you think about that? And
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree.
and And I mean, is your company Eminent Consulting? Are you planning on some maybe educational courses around the applications of industrial hemp, or anything related to that market in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely been kind of toying with the idea around looking at, as you said, the applications of industrial hemp, how to set up an industrial hemp grow, or what that might look like. We do have a course right now that is on hemp and CBD in particular. So kind of looking at the way that the DEA and the FDA are responding to hemp grown for commercial purposes, as well as just defining hemp. What I find is that a really important first step is letting people know that hemp is cannabis. Cannabis is hemp, right? There is no real difference in terms of the actual like genus or taxonomy of these plants. They're one and the same. The only thing that's different are their chemical constituents found in each group, and that was due to two different breeding pathways. And so, to your point, in the destigmatization of it all, I think it really helps the cannabis industry when we talk about hemp as just being a cousin to cannabis. It is cannabis. It's just cannabis with 0.3% THC or less. And actually, it can have all of these other kind of avenues, industrial avenues that we can employ and that we can harness from this plant. And there are like an incredible amount of advantages to that. And it's exciting to see states like Kentucky and the Carolinas that, in my mind, would never adopt any kind of like cannabis legislation, or would be the last to adopt any type of comprehensive kind of medical access to cannabis, but that are really now pioneering the industrial hemp industry. And that to me is like just dipping your toes in the water, of this whole thing. And again, furthers that mission of having people engage with and better understand plant medicine, because hemp is also plant medicine. Even if we look at only its industrial applications, it's still, to me, like medicine for the planet, which is important.
Right. Yeah. And I share that frustration with you in that, hemp is cannabis, cannabis is hemp. We have a government term, marijuana, right? And during the criminalization of cannabis. And then you have THC, which is kind of its own industry, right? Because you have adult use in various states and whatnot. So it's just very complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why it's important for me to just help clear those kinds of basic definitions up for people so that they get a better understanding of the landscape.
Yeah. Well, you've been doing a great job at it, and keep producing great content. I've really been enjoying those videos, Ask Emma, and other interviews you've been featured in. So, is there anything you want to leave the audience with, Emma, before we go?
I mean, thank you so much for having me on. This was a really fun conversation. And for anybody who wants to find more about me or my online courses, you can find all of that information at my company's website, which is eminentconsultingfirm.com.
Awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you. You've schooled us when it comes to the science of cannabis. So we appreciate it greatly and hope to have you on in the future.
Yeah, thanks again.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.